A fateful encounter. The air was cool that morning, crisp and refreshing after a long summer's heat. Leon Davis adjusted the knot on his tie, his thoughts already turning to the cases waiting for him at the courthouse. He'd spent the better part of his career working in that building, but no amount of familiarity could lessen the weight of responsibility he carried with each case. In his community, where he was both respected and scrutinized, being one of the state's top prosecutors wasn't just a job, it was a duty. As Leon walked down the quiet suburban street, the soft clicking of his polished leather shoes on the sidewalk seemed to echo in the stillness. The neighborhood was the kind of place that woke up slowly. Curtains rustled as people peeked out to see if the world still looked the same. Porch lights clicked off, one by one, as early risers shuffled to their cars, coffee cups in hand. But despite the familiarity of his morning route, Leon always felt a sense of detachment, as though he walked a fine line between belonging and standing apart. Near the bus stop, a faint sound broke the morning's rhythm. It was the shuffle of bags scraping the ground and the faint, frustrated grunt of someone struggling. Leon turned his head and saw her, an elderly woman in a faded cardigan, her gray hair pinned neatly back. She was hunched over a pair of grocery bags that looked far too heavy for her slight frame. The plastic handles dug into her hands, and the bags threatened to tear under the strain. Without a second thought, Leon altered his course. "Good morning, ma'am," he said, his voice warm and calm. "Can I help you with those?" The woman looked up, startled for a moment, before relief spread across her face. "Oh, bless you," she said. "These old bones aren't what they used to be. I just need to set them on the bench before the bus comes." Leon smiled and carefully took the bags from her, noting how light they felt in his grip. To her, they might as well have been sacks of bricks. As he set them down gently on the bench, he couldn't help but glance at her hands. They were knotted and veined, the hands of someone who had worked hard her whole life. "Thank you, young man," she said, reaching into her purse. "Here, let me give you something for your trouble." Leon waved his hand. "No need for that. I'm just glad I could help." She tilted her head, her sharp eyes studying him. "You're a kind soul. Not many people would stop, you know. Most folks are in too much of a hurry these days." "I'm just trying to start the day off right," Leon said with a chuckle. "You have a good one now." As he walked away, he felt a small sense of satisfaction. It wasn't much, but acts of kindness like that, small, unremarkable moments, helped balance the heavier parts of his work. Prosecuting cases meant dealing with some of society's darker corners, and Leon had always believed in the importance of doing the right thing, both in and out of court. But as he continued his walk, he noticed something odd. A police cruiser idled at the far end of the street, its engine humming softly. Leon didn't think much of it at first. Officers often patrolled the area, especially in the mornings. Yet when he crossed the intersection, he caught a glimpse of the officer inside, watching him intently. Leon felt a flicker of unease but kept his pace steady. He knew he looked out of place to some, a tall, black man in a nice suit, carrying a briefcase through a mostly white neighborhood at dawn. He could almost feel the weight of the officer's gaze, even after he turned the corner. By the time he reached the courthouse steps, Leon had shaken it off. He had more important things to focus on. As he passed through security, he exchanged nods with familiar faces, the guards who had known him for years. Once inside, he made his way to his office, where his assistant, Maria, greeted him with a stack of folders. "Morning, Mr. Davis," Maria said, handing him the files. "You've got a packed schedule today. First hearings in an hour." "Thanks, Maria," he replied. "Let's get to it." The day unfolded as it always did, reviewing evidence, preparing statements, and meeting with junior prosecutors. Leon moved through his routine with precision and focus, unaware of the storm that would soon disrupt his orderly world. It wasn't until much later, when the sun had fully risen and the courthouse was alive with activity, that Leon would understand the officer's lingering gaze that morning, and what it meant for the events to come. An arrest in the shadows. By mid-afternoon, the courthouse had transformed from the quiet building Leon had entered at sunrise into a bustling hub of motion. Lawyers strode purposefully through its halls, clients lingered anxiously outside hearing rooms, and clerks shuffled between departments with thick stacks of paperwork. Through it all, Leon stayed immersed in his work, his office door open just enough for Maria to occasionally peek in and hand him new files. He had just finished preparing his notes for a particularly complicated financial fraud case when his office phone buzzed. It was a text from his daughter, Nicole, a second-year law student who loved to update him on her progress. Her message was simple but cheerful. "Guess what? I got an A on my brief. Thanks for the advice." Leon smiled. He loved that Nicole sought out his guidance, even as she carved her own path in law. He typed a quick reply, "Proud of you. Dinner soon?" Before he could slip the phone back into his pocket, Maria appeared at his door. "Mr. Davis, you have a visitor," she said cautiously. Her tone was measured, and her expression unreadable. "Who is it?" Leon asked, setting down his pen. Maria hesitated. "A police officer. Says it's urgent." Leon frowned. He wasn't accustomed to police officers showing up at his office unannounced. "Did he say what it's about?" "No, just that he needs to speak with you right away." With a quick nod, Leon stood, buttoned his jacket, and followed Maria down the hallway. As they approached the main reception area, he spotted the officer. It was the same one he'd noticed that morning, standing near the cruiser. He recognized the sharp, narrow features of the man's face, the pale blue eyes that had been fixed on him earlier. The officer straightened when he saw Leon. "Leon Davis?" "Yes, that's me. How can I help you, officer?" "Officer Hayes," he replied curtly. "I'm going to need you to come with me." Leon blinked, surprised. "What's this about?" Hayes pulled a folded paper from his jacket pocket and handed it over. "There's a warrant. You're under arrest." Maria gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "What? This must be some kind of mistake." Leon opened the paper, scanning it quickly. It was brief, devoid of any detailed explanation. Just a name, his name, and a few sparse allegations: obstruction of justice, tampering with evidence. He could feel Maria's panicked gaze, hear the growing whispers from nearby staff. His face remained calm, his voice steady. "Officer Hayes, I don't understand. What evidence do you have? Who filed this?" "Not my job to discuss the details," Hayes said, his tone cold. "I'm just following orders." Leon carefully folded the paper and handed it back. "I know my rights, officer. I'll come with you, but I'll need to speak to my attorney first." Hayes gave a humorless smirk. "Yeah, you'll get your phone call." He reached for his cuffs. The clicking of the metal shackles echoed in the suddenly quiet room. Leon stood still, letting the officer secure his wrists. He glanced at Maria, who looked on the verge of tears. "Tell Nicole I'll be okay," he said softly. "She doesn't need to worry." Hayes gripped Leon's arm and began leading him toward the exit. Staff members in the hallway froze, their conversations halted mid-sentence. Leon felt their stares, the weight of their silence pressing on him as he walked by. Some looked confused, others alarmed. By the time they stepped outside, a small crowd had gathered on the courthouse steps. Word traveled fast in a place like this. Reporters, drawn by the scent of scandal, had already arrived. Their cameras clicked and flashed, their voices blending into a chaotic hum. "Mr. Davis, what's happening? Are the charges true? Did you know about the investigation?" Leon didn't respond. He focused on each step, refusing to let the cameras catch anything but calm determination on his face. The ride in the squad car was silent, save for the low crackle of the police radio. Leon stared out the window, his mind racing through possible scenarios. He knew he'd never tampered with evidence, never obstructed justice. It wasn't just a matter of professional pride, it was a matter of integrity. Someone, somewhere, had set this in motion. But who? And why? When they reached the precinct, Hayes led him through the processing steps with detached efficiency. His mugshot was taken under bright, unflattering lights. His fingerprints pressed onto ink pads and rolled onto paper. The whole process felt surreal, like something he'd only seen happen to others, never imagining he'd be the one in that chair. Finally, Hayes escorted him to a holding cell. "You'll wait here until the arraignment," the officer said curtly before walking away. The door clanged shut behind Leon, the heavy sound reverberating through the small, dimly lit room. He lowered himself onto the metal bench, his thoughts still spinning. This wasn't just an error. It was deliberate. Somebody wanted him out of the picture, and they'd gone to great lengths to do it. But Leon knew one thing for sure, he wouldn't let this break him. He'd worked too hard, fought too many battles, to let it end like this. Whatever forces were at play, he would uncover them. He would fight. Because this wasn't just about him, this was about the truth, about justice. And Leon Davis wasn't about to back down. The courtroom unfolds. By the time the courthouse opened its doors the next morning, the story of Leon Davis's arrest had already spread like wildfire. News outlets camped outside, their reporters breathlessly recounting his unexpected fall from grace. Inside, every corridor buzzed with speculation, whispered conversations echoing off the marble walls. Staff members exchanged worried glances, junior attorneys spoke in hushed tones, and judges passed one another with grim expressions. The courthouse had seen scandals before, but nothing quite like this. Leon sat in a small holding room near the courtroom, waiting for his initial hearing. A public defender had been assigned to him, an eager young attorney named Mark Bradford, fresh out of law school. Mark shifted nervously in his chair, his legal pad filled with scribbled notes. He was clearly overwhelmed by the weight of the case, but Leon admired his determination. "Mr. Davis," Mark began, trying to keep his voice steady, "I've been reviewing the arrest warrant and the initial report. They're vague, but we'll push for discovery. The prosecution will have to show their hand." Leon nodded calmly. "I appreciate that, Mark. But keep your focus on the facts. We don't need theatrics, just a clear presentation of the truth." Mark hesitated, then leaned in. "If I may, sir, why do you think this is happening? I mean, you're a respected prosecutor. It doesn't add up." Leon's gaze drifted to the floor. "It's hard to say. I've made enemies over the years, people who didn't appreciate losing their cases. Maybe someone saw an opportunity to smear my name. But until we know more, we stick to what we can prove." As the minutes ticked by, Leon maintained his composed demeanor, though a subtle tension lingered in the air. He wasn't afraid of the courtroom, he had spent decades arguing cases in that very building. But this time, he wasn't standing at the prosecutor's table. This time, he was the accused. When the bailiff opened the door and gestured for them to enter, Leon stood tall, adjusting his suit jacket. Mark walked slightly ahead, his shoulders squared in an attempt to project confidence. Together, they stepped into the courtroom. The room was packed. Rows of seats were filled with curious onlookers, reporters with notepads poised, and courthouse staff who had taken an early break just to watch the proceedings. The judge, a seasoned and fair-minded woman named Ruth Calder, sat behind the bench, her expression a mixture of curiosity and concern. She had known Leon for years and had seen his skill as a prosecutor firsthand. To see him standing on the opposite side of the courtroom felt surreal. At the prosecution's table stood Daniel Royce, a sharp and aggressive district attorney known for his ambitious nature. He was younger than Leon, with a reputation for cutting deals and chasing headlines. His presence added an unexpected layer of tension. Royce and Leon had never worked closely, but their paths had crossed enough for Leon to know that Royce was no friend. As Leon approached the defense table, the room seemed to hold its collective breath. Whispers spread like a ripple through the crowd. "That's Leon Davis. Can you believe it? What could he have done? This doesn't feel right." Judge Calder rapped her gavel once. "Order in the court." The room quieted, though a buzz of unease still lingered. Leon sat down, placing his hands on the table. His wrists were no longer cuffed, but the mark of the arrest weighed heavily on him. He didn't look at the crowd. Instead, he focused on the judge, meeting her gaze with steady determination. "Mr. Davis," Judge Calder began, her voice measured. "You are here today for your arraignment on charges of obstruction of justice and evidence tampering. How do you plead?" Mark stood, his voice firm. "Not guilty, Your Honor." Royce stood next, his voice smooth and calculated. "Your Honor, the state requests that bail be set at $1 million. Given the defendant's connections and resources, we consider him a flight risk." A murmur spread through the room. $1 million? It was a figure designed to shock, to keep Leon firmly under public scrutiny. Mark was quick to respond. "Your Honor, my client has deep ties to the community. He served this court system for decades. There's no evidence to suggest he would flee." Judge Calder held up a hand. "Enough. I'll hear arguments on bail after we address the preliminary evidence. Mr. Royce, the court will need to see your probable cause statement." Royce's confident smirk faltered for a moment. "Your Honor, we're still compiling certain evidence. However, the arrest was made based on credible information from a reliable source." Judge Calder frowned. "A source is not enough. I want specifics. Mr. Bradford, you'll have access to the prosecution's files before the next hearing. Until then, I'm setting bail at $200,000. Another murmur swept through the gallery. It wasn't the million Royce had hoped for, but it wasn't insignificant either. Leon knew he could meet the amount, but the implications were clear. His every move would be scrutinized from now on. As the hearing adjourned, Royce's team quickly filed out, their faces carefully neutral. Judge Calder exited the courtroom, leaving Leon and Mark to pack up their notes. Leon glanced at Mark, his expression unreadable. "You did well, Mark. Keep digging into their evidence. The truth will come out." Outside the courthouse, a sea of reporters waited. The moment Leon stepped into view, questions erupted. "Mr. Davis, what's your response to the charges? Are you going to step down as prosecutor? Do you think you'll beat the case?" Leon raised a hand but said nothing, walking steadily toward the car that would take him home. Mark followed closely, shielding his notes from prying cameras. As the car pulled away, Leon gazed out the window. The courthouse grew smaller behind them, but the weight of the day remained. He knew this was only the beginning. To clear his name, he would have to face not just the legal system he had once served, but also the court of public opinion. And he would have to do it without knowing who had set this entire ordeal in motion. The unraveling threads. The days that followed felt like a whirlwind. Leon returned to his modest suburban home, a place that had always been his refuge, only to find that refuge crumbling under the weight of unwanted attention. News vans idled outside, their cameras trained on his driveway. Neighbors avoided eye contact. Even his morning coffee run was interrupted by a stranger whispering, "Is that him?" Inside, the atmosphere was no less tense. Leon's daughter, Nicole, had driven down from her university the moment she heard the news. She paced the living room, alternating between furious rants and anxious silence. "Dad, this is insane. How can they charge you with something you didn't do? Leon remained seated in his worn leather armchair, his briefcase unopened beside him. Nicole, getting angry won't help. We need to focus on the facts, not the noise. Facts? Nicole shot back, her voice sharp. What facts? They don't have any. Why aren't you fighting back harder? I am, Leon said evenly. But fighting back doesn't mean losing your composure. It means being thorough. Methodical. That's what I taught you, remember? Nicole sighed, running a hand through her curls. I know. I just hate seeing you like this. You're the one who's supposed to be putting criminals away, not standing in front of a judge. Leon softened his tone. I appreciate that. But I'm not going to let this define me. We're going to find out who's behind it. Meanwhile, Mark Bradford was doing his best to keep the defense on track. He'd been working overtime, combing through the scant documents the prosecution had provided. The discovery file was thin, almost suspiciously so. There was no physical evidence tying Leon to any crime, no clear timeline, and no identifiable victims. Instead, the file relied heavily on the testimony of an unnamed whistleblower, someone who claimed to have inside knowledge of Leon's alleged wrongdoing. Mark met with Leon at his office one evening, the two sitting across a small table surrounded by stacks of legal pads and folders. Mark looked more confident than he had in court, though his inexperience still showed in the way he fidgeted with his pen. They're playing a weak hand, Mark said, tapping the folder in front of him. There's no smoking gun here. Just this so-called whistleblower's statement. It's vague and full of holes. Leon raised an eyebrow. What kind of holes? Well, for one thing, the timeline doesn't make sense. The statement says you supposedly tampered with evidence during a trial that took place last year. But I cross-checked the dates, and you weren't even in the courthouse that week. You were attending a conference in Chicago. Leon's lips pressed into a thin line. And they didn't bother to verify that? Mark shook his head. They didn't provide any corroborating documents. Just the statement. And get this, they won't reveal who the whistleblower is. They're claiming it's to protect the individual's safety, but it also makes it impossible for us to question them, Leon finished. Exactly. Leon leaned back, his mind working through the implications. Whoever had orchestrated this wasn't just careless, they were deliberate. They wanted to keep him on the defensive, to drain his time and resources, to keep the focus on him instead of on the truth. You said the whistleblower claims to have worked with me? Leon asked. Mark nodded. That's the implication. They claim to have witnessed you instructing someone to alter case files. But when we cross-referenced the staff list for that time period, no one matching the whistleblower's description was ever employed by the courthouse. Leon frowned. If that's true, then this person isn't just lying, they're fabricated entirely. Which means we need to dig deeper, Mark said. I've filed a motion for the court to compel the prosecution to disclose the whistleblower's identity. If we can get them on the record, we can start unraveling this. As the legal maneuvering continued, Leon's personal life remained under siege. Old acquaintances who had once respected him began to distance themselves. A neighbor who used to chat with him over the fence now avoided eye contact. Even his favorite diner, a place where he'd been a regular for years, seemed colder. Still, there were moments of warmth. Nicole stood by his side, fiercely loyal. Some of his former colleagues reached out quietly, offering words of encouragement and vowing to look into the case themselves. And then there were the letters. Every day, a handful of envelopes arrived in Leon's mailbox, their return addresses from all over the state. They were from people who had followed his career, who remembered how he had helped their families, their neighborhoods. Some were handwritten, others typed, but they all carried a similar message. We believe in you, Mr. Davis. Don't give up. One letter, in particular, caught his attention. It was from a man named Jerome Lewis, a retired courthouse janitor who had worked the night shift for decades. Leon remembered him vaguely, an older man with a quiet demeanor who kept to himself. In the letter, Jerome wrote, "I don't know much about what's happening now, but I do know one thing: you always treated people with respect, no matter who they were. I saw it every day, even when no one was watching. Don't let them take that away from you." Leon read the letter twice, then set it down on the kitchen table. The words didn't change his legal situation, but they reminded him of something vital. The truth had a way of surfacing, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. As he prepared for the next round of court hearings, Leon resolved to keep fighting. Not just to clear his name, but to expose the forces that had sought to ruin him. The threads of the case were beginning to unravel, and though it would take time, Leon knew that persistence, honesty, and determination would be his greatest allies, cracks in the foundation. The legal battles dragged on, but the tide began to shift. Mark's motion to reveal the whistleblower's identity was granted, and the prosecution was forced to produce their star witness. When the name was finally disclosed, Leon immediately recognized it. The whistleblower was an ex-convict named Derek Carr, someone Leon had prosecuted years ago in a high-profile corruption case. Derek's testimony had been instrumental in taking down a ring of dirty officials who were siphoning public funds into private accounts. Despite being a key witness, Derek himself had been far from clean. He'd cut a deal to reduce his own sentence in exchange for turning on his co-conspirators. Now, Derek's testimony was the cornerstone of the case against Leon. But something didn't sit right. If Derek had turned state's evidence years ago, why would he suddenly come forward with accusations against Leon now? The timing was suspicious, and Leon knew that uncovering Derek's motives was crucial. Mark worked tirelessly, pulling records from the old corruption case and interviewing anyone who might know why Derek had resurfaced. Late nights in the office became routine. Coffee cups piled up, and his desk was littered with legal pads filled with frantic scribbles. Leon, for his part, remained patient and steady, his experience as a prosecutor keeping him grounded. One night, as Mark pored over Derek's financial records, he spotted something strange. "Mr. Davis," he called out, gesturing for Leon to come look. "Take a look at this." Leon leaned over Mark's shoulder, scanning the highlighted lines on the screen. "Derek's been receiving large deposits into a trust account," Mark said. "They're not from a known employer. In fact, they're from a shell company based out of state. The payment started about 6 months before he came forward with these accusations." Leon frowned. "A shell company? Have you traced its ownership?" "Not yet, but we're working on it. The fact that these payments began before he accused you suggests he was incentivized. Someone's paying him to make this up." Leon nodded. "That's a good lead, Mark. But we'll need more than financial transactions to convince the court. Can we link this shell company to anyone connected to the prosecution?" Mark hesitated. "It's possible. I have some colleagues in corporate law who might be able to help untangle this." "Do it," Leon said firmly. "Whatever it takes." Meanwhile, Leon used his own network of legal contacts to quietly investigate Derek's activities. He reached out to a retired investigator he had worked with during the original corruption case, a sharp-minded detective named Carla Norris. Carla had an uncanny knack for spotting patterns that others missed, and her retirement hadn't dulled her instincts. Carla agreed to dig into Derek's recent behavior. Within a week, she uncovered something even more damning. Derek had been in contact with Daniel Royce, the ambitious district attorney handling the current case. Phone records and emails showed a pattern of communication between the two. While it wasn't illegal for Royce to speak with a witness, the frequency and secrecy of their exchanges raised red flags. When Leon confronted Mark with this information, Mark's eyes widened. This could be huge. If Royce coordinated with Derek before the accusations came out, it's a conflict of interest at best, and possibly prosecutorial misconduct. It's not enough to raise suspicion, Leon said. We need undeniable proof. Carla's still digging, and I trust she'll find something solid. Until then, we focus on the financial trail. If we can show that Derek was paid off, we can undermine the entire case. The courtroom hearings became increasingly tense. Royce, sensing the pressure, grew more aggressive. He pushed for expedited trial dates, hoping to keep Leon's team off balance. Mark, however, refused to be rushed. He requested additional time for discovery, arguing that the complexity of the case warranted a thorough investigation. Judge Calder, though patient, clearly grew weary of Royce's tactics. She granted Mark's requests, giving him the breathing room he needed. As Mark and Carla continued to piece together the puzzle, Leon maintained his composure. Each day brought more whispers, more stares, but he refused to let the scrutiny shake him. He knew that the truth was often buried under layers of deceit, and it was his job to dig it out. Eventually, Carla struck gold. She uncovered an email from Royce to Derek, sent months before the case against Leon was announced. The email was vague but telling. Royce had promised Derek an opportunity to redeem himself if he cooperated on a delicate matter. When Mark presented this evidence to Judge Calder, Royce's confident demeanor finally cracked. The judge demanded an explanation, and Royce stammered through a half-hearted defense, claiming the email was taken out of context. But the damage was done. The combination of the unexplained financial transactions, the hidden communications, and Royce's increasingly desperate behavior painted a clear picture. Someone had manipulated the system to bring Leon down. Judge Calder ordered an independent review of the case, halting all proceedings until the investigation was complete. The courtroom buzzed with tension as Royce sat at the prosecution's table, visibly shaken. As Leon left the courthouse that day, he felt a flicker of hope. The fight wasn't over, but the foundation of the case against him was beginning to crumble. And though he still faced an uphill battle, he knew one thing for certain. Truth had a way of finding its way to the surface. The turn of the tide. The independent review launched by Judge Calder turned the tide in a way no one expected. An outside legal auditor was assigned to the case, a no-nonsense former federal prosecutor named Angela Curtis. Known for her meticulous approach and unwavering impartiality, Curtis's involvement signaled that the matter was about to receive the scrutiny it deserved. Curtis and her team methodically combed through every piece of evidence presented against Leon Davis. They examined the whistleblower's financial records, correspondence, and the shell company payments that Mark had unearthed. They reviewed Royce's emails and his communication logs. Day by day, the seemingly solid case against Leon began to dissolve into a tangle of questionable motives, sloppy legal maneuvering, and outright misconduct. The findings were damning. Royce's relationship with the whistleblower was far more entangled than he had admitted. Email exchanges showed that Royce had not only encouraged Derek Carr to come forward with allegations, but had also coordinated the exact timing of the accusations to coincide with a key promotion Royce had been vying for. In fact, Royce's goal seemed clear. By taking down a prominent figure like Leon Davis, Royce could secure his reputation as a tough-on-crime prosecutor and position himself for a higher office. Even more troubling, Curtis's team traced the shell company that funneled money to Derek. Through a series of subpoenaed financial documents, they found it connected to a campaign donor of Royce's, a real estate mogul with a long history of backroom dealings. It became evident that the entire case had been built on a foundation of lies, bribes, and political ambition. When Curtis presented her preliminary findings in court, the atmosphere was electric. The courtroom was packed. Every seat was taken, and people even stood along the walls. The prosecution's once confident demeanor was shattered. Royce sat stiffly at the prosecution's table, his face pale and his jaw clenched. Leon, by contrast, sat tall and composed, though he remained quietly observant. Curtis addressed Judge Calder directly. Your Honor, our review has uncovered significant improprieties in both the investigation and the prosecution of Mr. Davis. These include, but are not limited to, a lack of credible evidence, improper coordination between the prosecutor and a witness, and a financial trail that suggests bribery. The judge's expression hardened. Ms. Curtis, are you recommending that the charges against Mr. Davis be dropped? Curtis nodded. Not only dropped, Your Honor. I recommend that this court initiate a formal inquiry into the conduct of the district attorney's office. The integrity of our justice system demands no less. Gasps and murmurs filled the room. Royce shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his previously unwavering confidence now replaced with visible unease. Judge Calder raised her gavel. Order. I will not tolerate outbursts in my courtroom. She turned her gaze back to Curtis. I've reviewed the documents you provided. Your findings are compelling. As of this moment, all charges against Mr. Davis are dismissed. Furthermore, I will appoint a special panel to investigate the conduct of Mr. Royce and his office. This is a deeply troubling breach of public trust. When the gavel came down, the sound echoed through the courtroom like a thunderclap. The spectators erupted in murmurs, and reporters rushed out to file their stories. The once smug Royce quickly left the courtroom, his head down, avoiding the cameras waiting outside. Leon rose slowly, feeling the weight of the ordeal begin to lift. Mark clapped him on the shoulder, his expression a mix of relief and quiet triumph. I knew we'd get there, Mark said, his voice steady but emotional. They couldn't hide the truth forever. Leon smiled faintly. Thank you, Mark. You held your ground, even when it wasn't easy. That made all the difference. As Leon stepped outside the courthouse, he was met with a crush of reporters and flashing cameras. Nicole stood waiting near the steps, her arms crossed, an expression of both relief and defiance on her face. When she saw him, she broke into a grin and ran forward. Dad, she exclaimed, throwing her arms around him. He hugged her tightly. It's over, Nicole. It's finally over. The cameras clicked furiously as the two embraced, but Leon barely noticed. For the first time in weeks, he felt a deep sense of peace. The scandal surrounding Royce's misconduct exploded across the headlines, overshadowing the false allegations against Leon. The district attorney resigned in disgrace. The investigation revealed a pattern of corruption within his office, leading to multiple resignations and several indictments. Meanwhile, Leon's reputation was restored. In the weeks that followed, Leon returned to his work, though he did so with a renewed perspective. The ordeal had reminded him of the fragility of justice and the importance of integrity. He used his experience to mentor young prosecutors, teaching them to value the truth above ambition. As for Mark, he quickly gained a reputation as a brilliant and principled defense attorney. He credited Leon's guidance and calm leadership with shaping his approach to the law. Together, they formed a friendship built on mutual respect and shared values. Though the scars of the experience would never completely fade, Leon emerged stronger, more resolute, and more committed than ever to ensuring that justice served everyone equally. In the end, the truth not only set him free, it reaffirmed his belief in the power of integrity and perseverance.